Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Toyba Ayankumbi. I'm one of the class marshals for the class of 2026. And on behalf of the class marshals, we are so grateful to have Professor Sachs here with us today. As you may know from our lectures with Professor Eichenser and Professor Sitkoff, the last lecture is an opportunity for the graduating class to hear final words of wisdom from a professor who has shaped how we think about the law and our place in it. Professor Benjamin Sachs is the Kestnbaum Professor of Labor and Industry here at Harvard Law School and the faculty director of the Center for Labor and a Just Economy. He is a two-time Teaching Excellence Award winner at both Harvard Law School and Yale Law School, and his scholarship has appeared in the Harvard Law Review, the Yale Law Journal, and the New York Times, amongst others. And as the leading expert in labor law and labor relations, his expertise is especially relevant today, including right here on our very campus. But to be clear, we did not choose him to give this lecture because of his resume. We chose him because his students told us that he treats them with warmth, dignity, and respect, that he has a profound belief in their ability to become agents of change, and that they leave his courses not only understanding the doctrine, but compelled to ask, why does the law work this way? Who does it protect? And could it be structured differently? In his work, Professor Sachs has said that what workers want most is dignity and fair treatment. And it is very clear that that has shaped his research, his advocacy, and how he shows up for his students. We are so thrilled to have him close up our time here at Harvard Law School. So please join me in welcoming Professor Benjamin Sachs for his last lecture.
Hi. Thanks so much for this opportunity to speak with you today. Before you walk across that commencement stage, get your diploma, and take up your first roles as Harvard Law School grads. I'm really, truly honored to be here. And let me start by saying congratulations on being nearly done with law school. This is a major life accomplishment that deserves much celebration. Given the importance of the occasion, and in order to figure out what to say today, I did what my training as a lawyer taught me to do, and I canvassed the relevant precedent. In this case, that meant watching a bunch of previous last lectures, and it meant speaking to colleagues who have done this before about what, in their view, made for a good talk. One consistent piece of advice I got was that I should tell you something about myself that you don't already know, and that is at least a little bit embarrassing. The options were essentially limitless. I thought about telling you that in my first years of teaching, I actually botched the start date of class, which I discovered while on a treadmill at Hemingway, when a 1L emailed me from a classroom full of students and no professor, and said, "Is everything okay?" I thought about one of the times I accidentally replied all to a very large listserv, but that one was actually just too embarrassing. I decided against these, and instead I'm going with this one. My favorite book isn't something by Rawls or Dworkin. It's not by Karl Marx or by Dickens or Shakespeare. No, my favorite book, by a good distance, is Lord of the Rings. In fact, I'm an unabashed Lord of the Rings nerd. I own an atlas of Middle-earth. I recently completed my 4th Lord of the Rings marathon at the Coolidge Corner Theater. That's 13 hours of movies in a single day. And as some of you have witnessed, the ringtone on my phone is music from the soundtrack to Fellowship of the Ring. And embarrassing as this is going to be, I think the books contain some important lessons about life, maybe especially these days. So I thought I'd start my talk with some of them. For those who aren't familiar, The Lord of the Rings is a trilogy written by J.R.R. Tolkien that takes place in a world called Middle-earth. The story involves a ring that was forged by a character named Sauron. This ring, the One Ring as it is called, is a source of enormous power. It enables its wearer to wield this power, but it also inevitably corrupts and ultimately destroys anyone who tries to use it. Long ago, in a time before the events of the trilogy, Sauron ruled over Middle-earth through the power of the ring. But Sauron is defeated in battle, and the ring is lost for centuries until it is recovered by a hobbit named Bilbo Baggins. At the outset of the trilogy, Sauron is back and he's searching for the ring. If he finds it, he will cover the earth in shadow, spreading misery everywhere. The trilogy is the story of the effort to destroy the ring and thereby Sauron and thereby save Middle-earth. In the first of the 3 books, Frodo Baggins has brought the ring from Bilbo's home to Rivendell for the Council of Elrond, where representatives of the peoples of Middle-earth are gathered to devise a plan to destroy the ring. It turns out that the only way to do that is to cast the ring back into the same fires in which it was forged, in Mordor, the very land that Sauron now controls. The task, for all intents and purposes, is impossible. Just getting to Mordor would be trial enough, but once in Mordor, the ring must somehow be smuggled past Sauron's watchful eye and through his army of orcs to the fires of Mount Doom. But someone's got to do it. Someone's got to take the ring to Mordor. So here's the scene where Elrond is asking the council to name a ring bearer. No one answered. The noon bell rang. Still no one spoke. Frodo glanced at all the faces, but they were not turned to him. All the council sat with downcast eyes as if deep in thought. A great dread fell on him, as if he was awaiting the pronouncement of some doom that he had long foreseen and vainly hoped might, after all, never be spoken. An overwhelming longing to rest and remain at peace by Bilbo's side in Rivendell filled all his heart. But at last, with an effort, he spoke, and wondered to hear his own words, as if some other will was using his small voice. I will take the ring, he said, though I do not know the way. And while things more or less work out in the end, it is extremely rough going for a long time. At one point on the journey, Frodo laments his decision. He says to Gandalf, the wise old wizard, I wish the ring had never come to me. I wish none of this had happened. And Gandalf replies, so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us. Class of 2026, we all wish that the world you are graduating into were different than it is. That it wasn't beset by democratic decline, by the disconcerting advance of AI, by an economy that is unaffordable to more and more people, by climate change, and by war. This, however, we do not get to decide. But what you do get to decide, what for better or worse you must decide, is what to do about these things, how to respond to these challenges, how to get your ring to Mordor, even though we don't know the way. Now let me explain what I mean in non-Tolkien terms. Everyone in the room knows that you are graduating in a time defined by a swirl of disruptive, disorienting, and destabilizing forces. Among the most troubling of these are the attacks on our important democratic institutions. We've heard this threat voiced so many times, I fear we may already have started to become numb to it. And so it's worth revoicing. To do that, I'll invoke what Professor Klarman recently named the top 10 threats to democracy, which are all emanating from the executive branch. Number 1, the use of the Justice Department to prosecute political adversaries for the explicit reason that they are political adversaries. The attack on law firms in an effort to gain control over the firm's choice of clients. Attacks on universities to gain leverage over what is taught by whom and to whom. The abolishing of entire federal agencies established by Congress. The refusal to spend money appropriated by Congress and the spending of money not appropriated by Congress. The cutting off of $10 billion in funding to Democratic states because they are Democratic states. The threatening of license revocation for media companies because those companies have been critical of the administration. The terrorizing of American cities by ICE, including routine violations of the First Amendment rights of peaceful protesters. Deportations without due process, including the forcible abduction of people by masked officers off the streets of American cities. Unconstitutional executive orders that interfere with state election administration. To this, I would add the president's recent call for a crime bill designed to crack down on rogue judges. As a graduating class, as you look out at the start of your legal careers, you are in the position of having to wonder whether judges will be safe from violence, whether the press will be censored, whether the law firms you work for will be free to represent clients they choose, whether we will have another fair election. In addition to these threats to democracy, as if that weren't enough, the swirl of disruptive forces you're confronting includes the accelerating advance of AI, a technology that has already upended what it means to be a student and a professor, a technology that it seems certain to, in the short term, upend much of the labor market and potentially to replace huge numbers of human workers with machines, including in law, including in the kinds of work many young lawyers do at the outset of their careers. AI is a threat in its own right, but it is also part of the broader reshaping of the American economy that over the last decade or so has made things that ought to be within everyone's reach, decent housing, healthcare, education, increasingly difficult to afford. A reshaping of the economy that makes what recently would have been a very livable salary seem insufficient. And we need to add to these challenges the ongoing and potentially life-altering process of climate change and the catastrophe of war in multiple parts of the world. I'll stop. A natural response to a world like this is duck and cover. It would be understandable if your reaction to any one of these developments, and certainly to all of them together, was to adopt the position of defensive crouch, devoting your energies and your talents to self-protection. It's also natural for those who have this luxury to simply pretend that this isn't happening, that everything is fine, or to just wait in the hope that things will eventually on their own go back to normal, to wish, like Frodo, that none of this had happened. I'm sympathetic to these reactions because I have had them myself. When the administration began targeting institutions of higher education and when people started losing their jobs for things they believe and teach and write, I was worried for the future of Harvard and for the long-term health of the country, but I was also frankly worried for myself and for my family. I've written plenty of things that are critical of the administration and the president. Would I pay a price for that? I wondered. Should I temper the things that I write? My protective, defensive instincts were on high alert. But while these are all natural reactions, it is also true that self-protection is not enough. To the contrary, times like these call on us to solve problems, not simply to protect ourselves from them. In fact, in the end, the only way to protect ourselves from problems like the ones we now face is to solve them. Because if we stay on defense, if we retreat from public challenges into spheres of private self-protection, we will eventually fail. We will eventually lose our democracy and our environment and our economy. So the question is, how can we possibly address these crises? What can lawyers do in the face of these massive threats, any one of which would overwhelm us, and which are hitting us all at the same time? To save you from disappointment, let me be clear, I don't have answers to any of these problems. In fact, the one thing that seems clear about all of them is that we haven't yet come up with a solution to any of them. For this reason, the challenges that you face as you graduate bring to mind Frodo and the Ring, but also here on the real earth, the community organization where I first worked after law school. The name of the organization was taken from the title of a book about popular education, which in turn was taken from a poem by Antonio Machado. That poem reads in Spanish, "Caminante no hay camino, se hace el camino al andar." Traveler, there is no road. We make the road by walking. That was the name of the organization, Make the Road by Walking. The poem captures the fact that in work and in life, there are times when we face challenges for which there is no roadmap, when nobody has done before the thing we have to do now. I think of these as make the road moments, times when we have no choice but to make our own road. Now, while many of the challenges you face are new, this is not by any stretch the first make the road moment in history. Far from it. Across our history, people have faced many such moments, and they've responded in a huge variety of ways. Oftentimes they have failed. Other times they have succeeded. And when they do succeed, their strategies share a similar feature, almost by necessity. They involved people trying something new. Not inventing a new approach out of whole cloth, not ignoring the history of what had been done before, but nonetheless doing something that hadn't been done before. The economic crisis of the Great Depression provided many such moments. One was the struggle of industrial workers who suffered unsafe and grueling working conditions and pay that was so low that they were unable to buy the products they were producing. This was part of what caused the Depression, a lack of consumer demand that came from wages that were too low to sustain adequate purchasing power. But changing these conditions required factory workers to take on the most powerful people in the country. For auto workers, that meant taking on people like Henry Ford. The auto workers had a plan. They wanted a union so that they could aggregate their bargaining power and demand improved conditions. But the auto companies were viciously anti-union, and the companies had on their side the police and the National Guard. Facing these massive challenges, the auto workers tried something new. They tried what came to be known as the sit-down strike. Labor historian Nelson Lichtenstein describes the developments this way. He writes, "History sometimes turns on a narrow pivot. The deep structures of economic power and social consciousness usually constrain the opportunities and shape the choices men and women have to make. But there are also times when circumstances conspire to greatly diminish our usual sense of social inertia and institutional stasis, when traditions' chains begin to crack and old fears diminish, thereby making the world once again seem plastic and open. In the auto centers of the American Midwest, such a time came in the winter of 1937. Our attention has rightly focused on Flint, Michigan, where union activists organized the great sit-down strike that forced General Motors to bargain. In a traditional strike, workers walk off the job. They stop working and leave the workplace. Shout out to the HGSU. This can be an effective tactic, But by leaving the workplace, traditional strikes make it easier for management to bring in replacement workers to take up the spaces left vacant by the strikers. So in the 1930s, in places like Flint, the auto workers needed a different approach, and they invented one. They stopped working and they stayed in the factory, occupying the workplace for days at a time in a manner that prevented management from using replacements to keep the assembly lines running. Thus was born the sit-down strike, and across the next handful of years, workers throughout the auto industry engaged in the new tactic. Now, occupying a factory, of course, you know this, constitutes trespass. And the sit-down strikes were met with intense retaliation in the form of National Guard and police violence. But the strikers held on, oftentimes engaging in military-style battles with police, until they won a union. And those unions transformed the economy, helping to solve the crisis of demand that had caused the Depression, and it is no exaggeration to say, helping to create the middle class in the United States. The sit-down strikes in the auto industry preceded another make-the-road moment, one of the most important in our history, the fight against Jim Crow. As Tomiko Brown-Nagin recounts in her book, Courage to Dissent, the civil rights movement had won important victories in courts in the 1950s, but segregation remained firmly entrenched. That changed in the 1960s when students jolted America and the civil rights establishment by taking the movement directly to the public. Facing incredibly difficult odds and confronting violent opposition from much of the American power structure, the students relied on the sit-in. To quote Professor Brown-Nagin, in 1960, 4 students from historically black North Carolina Agricultural and Technical College sat down at a Woolworth's lunch counter and ordered cups of coffee. The students' request defied Southern law, local custom, and company policy. Woolworth's personnel informed the 4 that they would not be served. In the face of the rebuff, the students remained in their seats rather than leave. Within days of the A&T protests, students in several other North Carolina communities followed suit. Within the month, the sit-in movement spread to other cities, including Nashville, Richmond, Baltimore, Montgomery, and Chattanooga. Within 2 months, the sit-in movement had spread to more than 50 cities. The sit-ins sparked a civil rights revolution that constituted a watershed in the history of America and a decisive break with the past. Legal action was displaced as the paramount strategy for achieving civil rights, replaced by direct action staged on a mass scale by thousands of young people who had previously been on the sidelines on the struggle for racial justice. Like nothing before, the sit-ins dramatized the evil of segregation and its incompatibility with ideas of democracy and equality. Now, not all make-the-road moments are like the Flint sit-downs or the civil rights sit-ins of world historical significance. Some are far more modest, smaller scale, even personal. I faced one of my own make-the-road moments at Make the Road by Walking. And I want to tell you the story of that moment because while not all of you will figure out a tactic that changes the course of civil rights history, all of you are now equipped to use law to develop new solutions to the really difficult and important problems that we face. My first day at Make the Road was my first day as a practicing lawyer. My work was focused on providing legal support for workers in the then prevalent sweatshops of Bushwick, Brooklyn. I'll never forget one factory in particular, a place called Superflex. Superflex produced plastic hosing, and the production process was designed in a way that workers were required to handle extremely toxic chemicals on an assembly line. In order to keep the assembly line moving without interruption, the employees were also required to stay at their workstations nearly continuously throughout their shifts, with a few minutes off to use the bathroom, but no break for meals. Without a lunch break, the Superflex workers would eat their lunches while working on the line, and thus inevitably ingest the production chemicals along with their food. One of the Superflex workers, a man named Antonio Lopez, came to make the road for help. Antonio worked on the part of the production line where labels were printed on the hoses. His job required him to load ink into a printer, apply printing to the hoses, and then coil and pack the hoses. He was not given gloves. He had no breaks, and he ate lunch while working every day. He was at Superflex for 2 years until he started having nosebleeds that wouldn't stop. He was diagnosed with complete kidney failure. Antonio's story, the Superflex story, was disturbing and angering, but it was not rare. In fact, the entire industrial economy of Bushwick was shot through with working conditions that seemed out of Upton Sinclair's jungle. This was 2001. Labor and employment laws were simply ignored. It was as if safety and health law didn't exist. Minimum wage violations were pervasive, with many workers still paid piece rates as if it were the early 1900s. Essentially, everyone was denied overtime pay. And then there was the continual overhang of fear that flowed from the workers' immigration status, a fear that was consciously manipulated by employers toward the goal of keeping everyone quiet. There were a couple possible solutions to this. One was to try and enforce employment laws, minimum wage, overtime, safety, and health, directly against the employers. The problem was that there were just too many factories and too few lawyers. We could win lawsuits for workers at 5, 10, even 50 employers, and there would still be hundreds of others to take their place. What the workers really needed was to organize into unions or community groups or workers' centers or something that would allow them to fight these conditions collectively and to make change across the economy, at least across the economy of Bushwick. And the workers were trying to organize. They were ready to fight these conditions collectively. The problem was that as soon as workers began talking about organizing, they were fired. And when a sweatshop fires the workers taking a lead role in an organizing campaign, it discourages any other workers from trying. There was another problem, one that will be familiar to all the labor law students in the room. The law meant to protect workers' right to organize, labor law, is a catastrophe. It's way too slow and too weak to work effectively. There's no private right of action, so you're entirely dependent on an underfunded agency to prosecute your case. And on top of all that, the statute essentially excludes undocumented immigrant workers from protection. So if we had taken the traditional route and filed unfair labor practice charges on behalf of the workers who got fired for trying to organize, we would have waited years for orders of reinstatement and might not have gotten them even then. Meanwhile, the factories would have defeated the organizing efforts. And then there was a final problem. Many of the workers in Bushwick at the time lacked immigration authorization for work and were subject to constant threats of deportation by employers seeking to quell any nascent organizing efforts. For me, this was a true make-the-road moment. The challenges seemed overwhelming, and nobody knew what to do. I was a year out of law school and really didn't know much about anything. I had gone to Yale. I worked with 3 other lawyers who were in the same boat. But in an unexpected way, I think our inexperience actually helped. Because we were so new, hadn't spent years doing these cases, hadn't developed a routine, we felt free to try something different, free in a sense to make it up as we went. Not, it's important to say, make it up out of whole cloth. We were deeply constrained by existing law and by the economic conditions in Bushwick and by the bite of immigration enforcement. So we had to look for space within all of these constraints to protect workers' organizing efforts from employer interference. Much of what we tried failed. It was pretty humiliating, actually, for a long time. But eventually, we came upon an idea that worked. What we decided to do was use employment law statutes like the federal minimum wage law as a tool to protect organizing. These statutes had some major advantages over traditional labor law. For one thing, they had private rights of action, which meant we could bring cases ourselves and not be prisoners to the glacial pace of the agency. The statutes also allowed for real damages, including punitive damages, that traditional labor law lacks. And it was still possible to argue that the statutes offered protection to all workers, irrespective of immigration status. There were lots of legal hurdles, but being not yet overly cautious young lawyers, we plowed ahead and in the end managed to convince the Department of Labor and the court that firing organizers of a minimum wage campaign is illegal retaliation under the minimum wage law. At least for a period of time, we found a way to offer some real protection to the organizing efforts of immigrant sweatshop workers in Bushwick. Now, I do not mean to convey that courts or creative litigation strategies are a complete answer to the world of challenges you face. They most definitely are not. I do not even mean to convey that we solved the multiple crises that afflicted Bushwick workers. We did not. What I do mean to convey, however, is that in the face of novel and seemingly overwhelming challenges, in the face of problems that we've never faced before, or that we haven't yet figured out how to solve, trying something new is the only way to come up with a solution. Sometimes those new approaches operate on a grand scale, like the sit-down strikes and the civil rights sit-ins. Sometimes they are far more local. But the way to solve the make-the-road moment is by walking, by not retreating or crouching or denying, but by improvising and inventing until the problem gets solved. All of you can do this. All of you have the capacity to look serious problems in the eye and imagine new strategies for addressing them. That's part of the power of a Harvard Law School education. All that Socratic questioning has equipped you to see down to the roots of a problem. And having seen the roots, you're positioned to imagine new solutions, to reimagine what the rules should be. In my view, anyway, that's what thinking like a lawyer means. The ways you will do this will vary enormously. Some of you will work in government, some for firms, some for legal aid societies or public defender offices. Some will run businesses. Some will start your own nonprofit organizations. But all of you can contribute to solving the problems that confront us. For some of you, this will involve every hour of your entire career. You will devote yourselves full-time to protecting democracy, or to regulating AI, or to making the economy work better for more of us, or to saving the environment. For others of you, this will involve your time away from work, whether it is taking steps to protect against climate change, or delivering groceries to neighbors threatened by ICE, or marching for peace, or helping to run your church's food pantry, or in whatever ways you figure out makes sense for you. But all of you can do this. And I urge you, do not wait. Do not wait to become more trained, or more experienced, or more senior. Take advantage of the spirit that comes with being young and new and unconstrained by old habits of practice. Your youth, by which I mean your age and your newness to the profession, is an enormous advantage and a critical resource at moments like we face. The energy, enthusiasm, and openness that comes at the start of a career is a treasure. As you get older and more experienced, you will develop skill and technique and maybe even wisdom. But a world beset by crises requires more than experience. It requires experimentation and improvisation, new ideas, and new approaches. That's why many of the most important and successful social movements in our history owe their success to young leaders. The organizers of the sit-down strikes were three brothers, Walter, Roy, and Victor Reuther. Walter, who would go on to lead the United Auto Workers, was 29 years old at the time of the sit-downs. Roy Reuther, who would later become actively involved in the civil rights movement, was 27. Victor was 24. The architects of the direct action components of the civil rights movement were college students. Roger Baldwin was 33 when he founded the ACLU. Alicia Garza was 32 when she began organizing the movement that came to be known as Black Lives Matter. Dolores Huerta was 35 when she led the grape boycott. These amazing people were your age. Okay, so how do you proceed? How do you face these make-the-road moments? The first step, as uncomfortable as it is to acknowledge what's going on, to acknowledge the extent of the disruption, the extent of the threats and the challenges that we are facing. Because if we don't do that, if we go about our lives as if everything is okay, we won't be positioned to respond. But acknowledging the enormity of the challenges need not leave us stunned or in crouches or in denial. Having acknowledged how real all this has gotten, the next step is to recognize that as deep as these threats go, they are things that we can address, and that the part of the way that we can address them is through law. Law, our subject, our field, our practice is big enough to make a meaningful contribution to solving threats even as big as these. That's part of the reason lawyers and law firms have been a target, because we are positioned to do something. So we acknowledge the realities and we recognize that we have access to tools that are useful. Then, and maybe most important, we need to build community around the efforts to combat these threats. Isolation is a recipe for despair and inaction. None of this can be done unless we act together. Like HLS grads before you, you will go on and do a vast array of amazing things. Whatever you do, it's critical that you stay connected to each other so that you have the strength and the resources to engage in all the struggles that are to come. That brings me to the last thing I want to say. And here I want to return to where I started, with what I saw in the other last lectures. Many of the lectures I watched started with some reference to the title, Last Lecture. The comments had the same gist. Mike Klarman wanted to be sure that people didn't think he was going to drop dead after the talk ended. Jeannie Sook-Gerson reported emails from colleagues who, upon learning that she was giving her last lecture, assumed that she had a terminal illness and wrote in sympathy. And it also occurred to me when I told my kids that I was doing this talk that I'd better clarify for them that I wasn't quitting my job. The obvious issue is that for the faculty, this isn't the last lecture we'll give. But in all likelihood, it's not the last lecture for you either. I suspect that probably more than once, you'll find yourself in attendance at another lecture somewhere, sometime in your future. So if it's not my last lecture and it's not your last lecture, then why last lecture? The answer is that this is our last lecture. You and me, us. The last time that we'll get to be together in an HLS classroom like this one. The last time I'll look out into the seats and see you. The last time you'll look up at the podium and see me. That might seem sad, but it doesn't need to be. The 3 years you spend at HLS is a unique time in your life. It's intense, often really difficult, but it's formative, and it's also fleeting. I'm sure that at some moments in law school, you've all thought to yourself, thank God I'm only here for 3 years. Maybe at other moments you've wished you had more time. When you look back on these years, my prediction is that they will seem both absolutely core to your lives and also like a blip, over before you could believe it. But let me offer a different perspective. For faculty, HLS isn't a 3-year period. It's a much longer project. For me, HLS began in 2008. It now includes 19 graduating classes. That's something like 15,000 students. This is an incredible source of potential community. My hope and my prediction is that HLS won't just be a 3-year period for you either. Your days as a student are coming to an end. The cold calls and exams will stop. But you will always be someone who learned law at Harvard. I said a minute ago that it's critical for you to stay connected to each other. That's true. But it's just as critical that we stay connected. That the HLS community we build, the community that we create to support us as we all face the very intense challenges of our moment, be one that includes faculty and students and graduates. That's not a community that will have a single vision of what it means to address democratic decline or AI or the economy. There is no single faculty perspective on anything. Lord knows even the 2 professors named Sachs don't agree on almost anything. Nor is there a single student perspective on anything. That goes without saying. But we share enough that HLS can be a meaningful community for the rest of our lives. This includes our core commitment to the rule of law as the basis for democratic government. And it includes our commitment to the promise, though far from actualized, of equal justice. This possibility of a shared community with you makes this moment much less sad for me. It makes it a moment not of saying goodbye, but of looking forward to working together on solving the problems that confront our world. The possibility of a shared community with you makes me optimistic that we will get the ring to Mordor, even though we don't yet know the way. Thank you very much.